Welcome everybody to the first session of student talks here at LAST. We have a wonderful opportunity to listen to some very high quality student presentations here today, covering a variety of topics. I'm really excited. My name is James Goodenberger. I'm an assistant professor of economics here. This is my first year here, so this is my first LAST. I'm excited to see some of our students' excellent scholarship work. Our first student today is Caroline Stanfield. Caroline is a double major in art history and behavioral neuroscience with a concentration in public health. She plans on graduating in 2021. Yeah. She is the vice president of WISE, which is the Women in STEM Empowerment, and she is also a member of the women's lacrosse team. In her presentation today, she is going to explore the mental state of Vincent van Gogh and how that influenced his artwork. Thank
you. So hi everyone, my name is Caroline Stanfield. As he so nicely stated my nice little intro. This is going to be my presentation on Vincent van Gogh and mental illness, and I did this for my last semester with Dr. Collins in his 17th and 18th century art history class for my honors designation. So, most notably, if you don't really know anything about art, you know at least something about Vincent van Gogh, and if you look to the right, this is a picture of him as an early child. He was born on the 30th of March in 1853. And unfortunately, this was the same date that his eldest brother was born, who unfortunately died. So he had to basically live in the shadow of his brother his whole entire life. And he's arguably one of the most influential and noteworthy artists of the art period, specifically within modern art. Unfortunately, he was a troubled mind. His parents sent him to boarding school 3 times. And in a note to his brother Theo, he described his childhood as austere, cold, and sterile. So I don't know about you, but that doesn't sound like the best childhood to me. And so, in addition, people mostly know him for cutting his ear off, which actually is a myth. That didn't happen. He had OCD, and he was unhappy with how his beard was looking, so he just nicked his ear a little bit. So just a fun fact there, in case anyone ever says that, it's not true. And he was born into an upper middle class family, which is most not like artists of the time. His dad was a priest, which he tried to follow in the footsteps of, and his mom was from an upper echelon middle class family within Germany. And so I'd like to start off with an overall synopsis of the mental illness. Yes. Okay, so a big part of my paper was the nature versus nurture debate. And so I'm going to be asking the question of, was Vincent van Gogh a troubled mind due to an inherently flawed genetic code, or was it due to his turbulent childhood and environment which he lived in and grew up in? So I'm going to be exploring the topics of epigenetics, which is a new field within biology. And it looks at how environment impacts traits and how traits are being expressed, specifically within acetylation and methylation. Within acetylation, the DNA code, the acetyl group is added, and the machinery that is used for transcription and translation is more easily accessed via histones that are opened up. In contrast to that, methylation is basically the same process, except a methyl group is added onto the DNA, and the DNA is not as accessible to be transcribed and translated. In addition, I'll be talking about the painting mechanisms and to the nurture side of this debate. At the time, at the end of his life, Vincent painted 1,500 paintings, and at the time, paint had lead in it, which obviously is not good, and he might have had arsenic poisoning due to his fact of instead of dipping his paintbrush, to change the color palette he was working with and put it in his mouth. So just imagine 1,500 paintings, that's a lot of lead within your system, not too good. Okay, so next slide. Okay, so I'm going to first talk about schizophrenia. And schizophrenia affects every aspect of how a person feels, perceives, and understands the world. Unfortunately, it's still one of the least understood mental illnesses within the modern world, but we do know that around 2% of every ethnic group and subculture experiences some subset of this mental illness. Unfortunately, in the 1800s, when Vincent was alive, it was misdiagnosed a lot as the possession of demons and was used as a form of exorcism instead of getting adequate medical treatment. So the positive and negative symptoms of schizophrenia are what modern psychiatrists and psychologists use as a diagnostic tool via the DSM-5. Positive symptoms are categorized as something that is being added into the environment via hallucinations and illusions. In one of his letters to his brother Theo, he quoted, "If you hear a voice inside of you, say you cannot paint, by all means silence that voice." Also, the negative symptoms, one of the categoristic negative symptoms is a lack of affect, which means you're not interested in activities that kept you alive and feeling good beforehand. In addition to his symptoms of that, he stated to his brother Theo, "I have lost my will to paint." So he was basically losing interest in activities that once satisfied his artistic soul. And this really confused his view on reality. And I have a short video to play for you guys just to understand a little bit more about the auditory hallucinations that you would experience. And if you at any point feel uncomfortable, just quietly get up with you.
Where am I? Where are you going? Look out!
This is pointless. Even that kid knows you're stupid. Everyone knows you're stupid.
Don't go in there. Don't go in there.
Nobody cares about me. Why do you even try? Why do you even bother?
What are you looking for?
Things listening to you.
You don't deserve
The
happiness.
mind walls.
She's a laughing. She's talking.
I'm looking at you.
Everybody laughs.
She was talking about
Go ahead. Get some ice cream.
You don't know.
because
It'll make you fatter than you already are. Worthless.
Look out!
the alcohol. Just walk around. Don't take that one. Now go over to the other one. Grab wine bottle.
Go ahead.
A couple bottles of booze. Just
Drink it.
you're
Eat it.
getting tired.
Look out!
Passed out. Nobody cares.
Worthless. Nobody wants you. No one could.
Some junk food.
They don't care.
Look out!
People. I'm talking about you.
You
You're
can't.
just a loser.
Okay, so that was just to give a short snippet of what it's like to experience auditory hallucinations, and obviously that's not the most positive voice, so hearing that throughout your entire life would obviously be very hard to concentrate on things, much less just have a conversation with someone, and if left undiagnosed, we can see how that could have impacted his mental state very easily. So, so next slide. Yeah, you're good. So the first thing that I'm gonna analyze is the Night Cafe by Vincent van Gogh. It's an oil-on canvas painting that Vincent created in 1888, and it's 72.4 centimeters by 92.1 centimeters. It's basically a harsh depiction of how Vincent perceived everyday life and how he saw nightlife specifically. And obviously with all paintings, specifically with Vincent, this is very symbolic. And I'd like to first point your attention to the three, I guess they look kind of like light bulbs, but if you look more closely at them, they look like eyes. And so the psychotic symptoms of schizophrenia impair cognition and make individuals feel as if everyone is out to get them. So Vincent displayed this via the lights looking like eyes. In addition to, you can see that the bartender who is located behind the pool table is facing directly towards the viewer, so obviously that makes you feel a little bit uncomfortable. And also, if you look at everyone else in the cafe, although they may not be looking exactly at Vincent, their body positioning is towards him, making him feel obviously uncomfortable, claustrophobic, and all of the above. And so, another theory within this painting is that it was the transition from Impressionism to Expressionism in the late 1800s. So it was an inkling of what Vincent felt and not necessarily what he sees. And so most likely the night cafe did not look like this, but it's just what Vincent wanted to show us what he saw and what he felt on an everyday life. In addition, you can interpret this painting as Vincent was under the influence while he painted this. He often turned to alcohol as a form of self-medication. And you can see this in the painting via the harsh outlines. And if you look at the paneling, it's definitely slanted and is from a very interesting viewpoint in which the viewer is not really sure what to do. The next painting that I'm going to analyze is of Star Night, which everyone pretty much knows this painting. If you don't know anything about art, you at least know something about this. And it was created in 1989, a year after the Night Cafe was created, and it's also an oil-line canvas, which was Vincent's favorite mechanism to paint. It was 73.7 centimeters by 92.1 centimeters, and it basically reflects the entirety of Vincent's life via looking outside the mental hospital a few days before he committed suicide, unfortunately. And if you see below the rolling hills, there is a church, there is an art gallery, and there is a house. So basically what Vincent was doing was he was reflecting on every single aspect of his life that he felt he had failed in. At his house, at his home in Germany, and shortly after that in Paris, France, when he moved, he felt that he was not connected to his family, and his brother Theo was one of the only family members that he felt like he could confide in. In addition, after graduating and coming back from the boarding school, he attempted to become a minister, in which he had failed, and that was basically the only mechanism he had to survive at the time, was either to become a scholar or to become a priest, which he didn't either. In addition, his artistic career was a failure. He never sold one piece of artwork throughout his entire career. These priceless pieces of artwork only became noteworthy after he died. And to show the signs of psychotic behavior within this painting is if you look towards the night sky, there is a rolling hill effect, which is now basically a perfect example of the theory of turbulence within physics. And I don't know a lot about physics, but I tried to dabble a little bit to understand this. And so basically, the theory states that the night sky is engulfed with a constant bombardment of moving and colliding particles such as atoms and molecules. So at the time, in the 1800s, obviously telescopes were not readily available. So that leads us to question that how can someone that is mentally ill, does not have access to the important equipment that is needed to view the night sky, how could he have possibly postulated this? So, I don't understand. Okay, so I'm also going to talk about manic depression. And we know that through his notes to his brother Theo, he had multiple attempts of suicide, and I feel like this picture pretty well depicts of what it's like to be manic depression, which is bipolar disorder. It's basically what you see and what I feel. So when someone has manic depression or bipolar disorder, it's categorized by feelings of mania and then categorized by feelings of extreme depression, in which the mania is experienced anywhere from 2 to 5 times a year, while alternating between that and depression. And we know that through his notes, through his brother Theo, that he experienced the high end of that, so 5 times a year. So he was very severely bipolar and did not receive any help and medication for that. In addition, going back to the nature versus nurture debate, how did this happen with him? It could have possibly been from his turbulent childhood, in which he felt that he had to live up to his deceased elder brother, and he felt so much pressure from his family to either become a scholar or a minister, which both he failed at. And also, what I mentioned earlier, the possible lead poisoning. If a certain amount of lead or arsenic builds up within your blood, you have feelings of psychosis and mental confusion. So I like to go, a bigger picture of the modern day and have an ethical kind of discussion about this. So the question I'd like to pose is, would Vincent van Gogh have been the same? So would he have been the possibly avant-garde painter and creative and impacted so much of the modern art world if he would have been medicated. And with medication, psychiatrists and psychologists only know for certain how two medications interact with each other. So if someone like him who would have had bipolar disorder, would have had depression and schizophrenia, he would have been up to anywhere on 7 medications a day, which would have had a plethora of side effects, lack of effect, sadness, like cotton mouth, like anywhere from that. And unfortunately, in the modern day, the #1 prescribers of mental illness medications are actually OBGYNs, followed by primary care physicians. So obviously people that are not capable of prescribing or not as licensed to prescribe mental illness medications are. So this contributes to the medication-reliant society in which we seek more to band-aid the issue instead of going to the root of the problem. So I'd like to conclude this by saying a quote from Vincent in which he said, "Normality is a paved road. It is comfortable to walk, but no flowers grow on it." So my question to you guys is, as a society, what will we now define as a paved road?
Our next presenter is Sophia Summerlin. Sophia is an English major, and she plans on graduating in 2021. She is a member of the Tower magazine staff, as well as the art club here at Oglethorpe. And just as soon as we get her set up. In her presentation today, Sophia is going to introduce us to America's Bohemia, and she will specifically focus on the literature of Allen Ginsberg and its influences on the work of Patti Smith.
Thank you for being here. Just a little context on the process of this paper that I'll be reading. It started off more as like a general fascination with counterculture and counter literature. You might think of the Beat Generation, faces like Allen Ginsberg, Jack Kerouac, William Burroughs, and rock stars like Patti Smith. But it really developed into what I enjoy. Solidifying a lot of abstract concepts, things that used to be abstract or taboo, and now is part of our public consciousness, something that we've absorbed throughout centuries. And I like being able to track that sort of progress, even if our culture is more capitalistic, more oppressive. Thank you. And my paper is titled "The Mysticism of Nowhere, the Spirituality of America's Bohemia." America's Bohemia is a place liberated from the geographical and local boundaries of a fixed location. It has many names in a variety of places, but ultimately rests in the temperament and intelligence of individuals staking their position in a social revolution. Allen Ginsberg and Patti Smith were among these individuals who fostered art in this Bohemia in the 50s and on to the 70s. Their art radicalized love and liberation, influencing the reshaping of the political climate of America. This reshaping altered the relationship of public and politics. Allen Ginsberg's reading of Howl in 1955 called out to a generation of beatniks and bohemians who offered their literature, art, and lifestyles to their society. When Patti Smith began her participation in these bohemian scenes, a platform for her poetry, music, and literature had been made available through the contribution of Ginsberg and few writers. Smith's memoir, Just Kids, shares their spirit. In this paper and presentation, I will discuss the influence of Allen Ginsberg's literature, primarily his most influential poem, Howl, on artists such as Patti Smith, and how this influence has maintained the structure of Bohemia. The spirituality that Allen Ginsberg signified to the public consciousness centered around the choices, journeys, and needs of the individuals. He developed this mode of thinking as he related his personal experiences to the mystical moments and diverse cultures of religious backgrounds. This method of selecting and combining insights offers a holistic view of what is often a solitary and confusing revelation, allowing the individual to find explanations through their experience. The selective language used in Howl enforces individual ideals as the characters of the poem show further interest in alternative religiousness and philosophical discourses. Who studied Plotinus Poe, St. John of the Cross telepathy, Bob Kabbalah because the cosmos instinctively vibrated at their feet in Kansas. Here, Ginsberg is melding philosophy, American 19th century poetry, Christianity with Jewish mysticism to develop a pluralistic vision of spirituality. Religious researcher Yuval Ariel claims that Ginsberg was a forerunner and prophet for a postmodern era in which individuals select and combine their spiritual interests. This is apparent in the naming of the pluralistic spirit, Plotinus Poe, St. John of the Cross telepathy, which is a methodological fusion of great writers, great thinkers into one singular entity. Experiences began to be understood through abstract and mystical terms, therefore answers were sought in the same mode. The characters in part 1 of Howl are presented as angels. Regarded with love, these angels are defined by their defeats, which is, of course, the Howl that is in conversation. A howl from the broken down and flattened out individuals who still maintain a perfect passion to believe. These angel-headed hipsters burning for the anciently heavenly connection to the starry dynamo are depicted through their failures and defeats. They were expelled from the academies, cowered in unshaven rooms and underwear. They ate fire in paint hotels, drank turpentine in Paradise Alley, death or purgatory their torsos night after night. Associating defeated angels with multi-religiosity is a paradox that characterizes the American Bohemia. Their contradictory nature seems to disrupt the holistic spirituality that Ginsberg established, and a surreality is newly evoked. By joining features of the secular and the holy, surreal juxtaposition, which Ginsberg believed occurred naturally as a result of acute perception, defeat can be acknowledged as a viscerally mystical experience. To get this effect, Ginsberg relied heavily on the disorientation caused by manic repetition and surreal juxtapositions, fully amalgamating to the primary conflict between the harshness of the world and the vulnerability of the individual. The characters' experiences with defeat are of such intensity that they become illuminated, achieving transcendence. Bohemia allowed for these transcendent realities to exist safely in the consciousness of its community. Performative art intends to present the intricate workings of the inner mind or the inner life in an environment that is willing to support it. In this sense, performance behaves as a ritual for Bohemians. Early Bohemians participated in theater, emphasizing the collective belief that art was for the sake of life, not strictly for the sake of art. Instead of creating reified art objects, the new Bohemians hoped to integrate artistic expression into their daily lives. The Sixth Gallery reading in 1955, October 1955, achieves this integration of art into the quotidian. The reading was a pivotal moment when, in the subterranean world of dissent, nonconformist American writers defied the chilly climate of Cold War and came out into the open. The voices that had been ignored, dismissed, and repressed began to be heard by culture at large. Howl portrays Ginsberg's internal life through stark contrasts between stanzas of transcendence and illumination and stanzas of anxieties and determined and controllable forces. Moloch, the character in part 2 of Howl, is presented in a mantric frequency that condemns the Canaanite god for its oppressive nature and excessive sacrifice. Ginsberg equates the merciless god, represented in Milton's Paradise Lost, as a vengeful militant rebel angel with capitalist culture and war. Moloch is described with passionate denunciation, Moloch the incomprehensible prison, Moloch the crossbones soulless jailhouse of Congress of sorrows, Moloch whose buildings are judgment, Moloch the vast zone of war, Moloch the stunned governments. Moloch, being an evil rebel angel, blatantly juxtaposes part 1, in which angels are defeated angels. Howl establishes angels as soldiers and rebels to illustrate rebellion as holy and not criminal. The form of Howl is equally nonconforming as it produces themes of a blown-out, visionary, material world conflict. This is evident in the description of organized structures such as jailhouses and buildings. The defeated and holy beings pursuing holistic spirituality and love are only met with stone and war, resulting in a cycle of failures. Ginsberg inscribes this war as a paradigm for the fight that he really staked his values in, the fight against Moloch and for Bohemia. However, it was not Moloch that defined Bohemia, but it was love. The central represented experiences of Americans were programmed by images of war, pain, and corruption. But for Ginsberg, the substance of reality reached through mystical experience is love. In this actualized state, no time exists. While Howl is seen as a protest against the dominant culture in America, Ginsberg's intentions were not wholly related to this cause. In a letter to American poet Richard Everhart, Ginsberg defends Howl from Everhart's notion that the poem is destructive or negative, stating that it is only if the thinking is an outmoded, dualistic, puritanical, academic theory-ridden of values can you fail to see that I am talking about the realization of love. Through mystical and visceral images portrayed in Howl, Ginsberg summons a great deal of sympathy that distorts the self-deprecating images of ourselves and replaces the images with reflections of the angels which we most deeply are. He deems all mankind to be angels capable of transcending the everyday, if only possible through encountering failure and holiness. Ginsberg, who wrote Moloch Whom I'm Abandoned, officially denounces despair and corruption and embraces the new creation of America's Bohemia. Patti Smith immersed herself in the avant-garde scenes in America with values and concepts that parallel Ginsberg's own. The acceptance of newly regarded experimental literary forms fashioned Smith's first artistic career in poetry. The Poetry Project at St. Mark's Church, one of Bohemia's many names, was a forum where a multitude of poets, including Allen Ginsberg, were invited to read in the lively literary scene of New York. Her first reading was February 10th of 1971. In her memoir, Just Kids, Smith describes the Poetry Project forum in a determined and stoic manner. Everyone from Robert Creeley to Allen Ginsberg to Ted Barrington had read there. If I was ever going to perform my poems, this was the place to do it. My goal was not simply to do well or hold my own. It was to make a mark at St. Mark's. I wanted to infuse the written word with the immediacy and frontal attack of rock and roll. Smith was already prepared to further push the boundaries of what performance had become. Entering into the Bohemian spirituality, she engaged in the ritual of spoken word and elevated the experience by implementing her inner self, the rock star, into her performance. Smith's opening of the poem began with Mac and Knife, accompanied by Lenny Kaye on electric guitar, and reinstated a uniqueness to the figure of the poet. Smith's performance in St. Mark's Church inspired the first ever electric guitar to be played in the holy and hallowed grounds, and this received both intrigue and upset. Ultimately, however, Smith's primary incentive was to be different. Reflecting on her reading, Smith said, "She had to take into account that I seemed to have a whole other side. What it had to do with art, I wasn't certain." She understood that her inner self did not parallel the other performers, and so she had no desire to perform as they did. This has been criticized by many scholars as her rejection of community and a somewhat egotistical belief that the forms were secondary to her individual accomplishments. However, to be influenced singularly by an artist in one's own community, experimental literary craft risks becoming standardized and placed into the dominant culture. Smith's first reading bared the integrity of protecting this ideal. Monday's Children, the first part of Just Kids, engages with Smith's religious origins that quickly developed into a spirituality of art, literature, and a notion of God. Although not specifically mentioned in the book, Smith and her siblings were brought up as Jehovah's Witnesses. Smith was placed in Sunday school by her mother, where at the end of class, children would line up to receive a spoonful of honey. Smith says, "I instinctively shied away from the spoon, as she was a sickly child and only one spoon was used for many children. But I swiftly accepted the notion of God." Leaving this austere, organized religion behind when she was only around 12 years old, Smith began to value prayer and literature with primary importance. Smith's musical career expresses her personal insights on reality through religious and spiritual allusions in her lyrics. In the early part of her career, her songs are sometimes aggressively inclinastic. The famous refrain in the tellingly titled Gloria in Excelsis Deo goes, "Jesus died for somebody's sins, but not mine." But the work that followed was increasingly saturated with religious and specifically Christian allusions. She melds her religious appreciation with Catholic imagery and divine musicality that bear holy resemblance to songs. Smith uses detail and precision in her picking of spiritualities that mixes to her distinct aesthetic quasi-spirituality. Truth is the ultimate characteristic that America's Bohemia thrived on. In a time of distrust and skepticism, people turned to one another for the answers to this transcendence. Smith was among the confused individuals of the 60s and 70s, but her relationship with Robert Mapplethorpe helped her discover clarity in the absurd modern world. When he had not yet vocalized his homosexuality and fear that it would ruin his and Smith's relationship, the couple was placed in a situation where their love no longer made sense within a binary mode of thinking. To this point, Smith states, "We needed time to figure out what all of this meant, how we were going to come to terms and redefine what our love was called. I learned from him that often contradiction is the clearest way to truth." Her personal experience at this time was a small-scale version of Ginsberg's surreal juxtaposition, but no less applicable to the sense of defeat that disturbed their lives. The beat coterie was able to provide truth within the group through intimate friendships. Smith and Mapplethorpe had each other to do the same. Truth was available to Smith through non-binary and non-conforming relationships within the avant-garde scenes. Her relationships with others were treasured through the mutual ability to communicate beyond the material and into the soul. The inner world was bare, and although still complicated, was unsuppressed. With the self being unrestrained and honest, doubt could be removed from the people and replaced with faith. Bohemia is not a place for uncertainty, but a place for active seeking. And now the question must be posed as to the longevity of America's Bohemia. America today is not recognized by the avant-garde experimental scenes, but instead by dominant culture distinguished by capitalism, violence, and a largely polarized public. However, the art and literature produced in the 60s and onto the 70s still prevails and cements the life of Bohemia in history. To this day, Ginsberg and the Beats are a topic of interest, as seen through the opening of the Beat Museum in 2003, and university exhibits dedicated to Beat writers such as Emory University's The Dream Machine, The Beat Generation, Counterculture in 2017. With steady and growing fascination in the Beats, there remains the interrogation of social norms, acceptance in artistic and personal experimentation, and tolerance and integration of various belief systems and religions. In December of 2018, Jerry Portwood of Rolling Stones magazines interviewed Smith on her life today and why her album Horses still endures. Portwood's final question of the interview was, "Is death something you fear?" Smith concludes in true Bohemian nature, "No, I don't fear it. I'd like to live a really long time because I have a lot of work to do. I do want to see my children as they continue to grow, and I have so many ideas. I'm just hoping that if I take care of myself, I'll have a good amount of time to do these things. I've never really had any vice problems. My only addiction was to love and coffee. You don't have to worry about me." I cannot help but to connect Smith's response to the question of Bohemia's longevity. She answers with unwavering certainty and, as always, evokes a voice that supports her artistic strength. Her poetic and literary and music prowess transformed Bohemia, reinstating the power of the individual in art. I conclude with the comfort that Smith has granted. I am not worried for America's Bohemia. Thank you.
English major with a political science minor, and she is planning on graduating in 2020. She is a member of Chi Omega and Alpha Psi Omega. We have Melody Weckel. Melody is an English major and a writing minor. She's graduating in 2020. She's the president of Oglethorpe University College Democrats and the parliamentarian and honor council secretary of Sigma 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 sorority, Epsilon Theta chapter. We have Emily Rodriguez. Emily is a double major in English and art history, graduating in 2020. She is the editor-in-chief of the Tower Literary Magazine and the vice president of Upsilon Rho chapter of Sigma Tau Delta. And finally, we have Victoria Lee, an English major, gender studies minor, planning on graduating in 2020. She is a section leader and PR chair for the chorale and singers and secretary for the Soundbite Acapella. She is also a member of Sigma Tau Delta and is the philanthropy chair of Mu Phi Epsilon. And I was told they purposefully named their presentation or the panel a little provocatively, Jane Austen is gay.
Just to give a little bit more of a scope of what our panel is about, besides just Jane Austen is gay, which we all support, but also, so we were all in a class with Dr. Buchak back in the back, we love very much. He led us through the work of Jane Austen, and it kind of sat really well with us. We really took a love to studying her work and her also as an individual. Our panel is more about the alternative narrative of women in a limited sphere of agency and alternative roles that are available to them in the 19th century and 19th century literature. So my paper that I want to begin speaking on was about Jane Austen and her ability to develop the female protagonist. So the idea that her work mostly focused on females. As her protagonist, she often got a lot of the comments of, why not focus on a man? Why not have a man be the subject? Why are your men in the background? Why are they all relatively follow the same lines while your women are so like fleshed out and have such character arcs? And she kind of laughed at that, and her response was, go away. So she continued to kind of flesh out this female character, much of which we see today in female characters, but what I really enjoyed focusing on was the over arc between the beginning of her work towards the end of her work and kind of the arc that she followed, beginning with what I focused on, the Dashwood sisters in Sense and Sensibility, these two sisters that kind of foiled each other in a very Parent Trap kind of way, where one sister followed her heart and her passions, and the other sister was more logical, and throughout the novel we can see the sisters start to kind of intertwine in the way that they are motivated and what pushes them forward in their own individual marriage plots,
going from being sense and sensibility to kind of each being an intertwined version of both. We also see in this more earlier phase of work the beloved Elizabeth Bennet, who is very well known from Pride and Prejudice. She is often used as a feminist icon, a female character for standing up for herself, what she wants, pushing against the idea of her family wanting her to marry for social status, for money. She resists that. She follows her own passions. She marries Collinford. Yeah. So she's very well known. But we see Jane Austen actually move from characters like this, characters that resist the social situations that they are in, characters who are resisting the society in which she is writing about, and as she moves forward towards more middle and later works that she writes on, we see characters where society becomes almost its own character that plays with them. We see characters like Fanny Price, who is more reserved and quieter and less outspoken, and we see her develop a character arc which is very formed in the society in which she lives, as opposed to just being a reactionary or being a resistant of her own society. She kind of plays with society. She is not necessarily everything Jane Austen is trying to represent. She is almost a faction of what Jane Austen wants to represent. She is used as a tool to display something as opposed to being that resistance in itself. As we move on towards the later novels, mainly I focused on Northanger Abbey with the character of Catherine and Persuasion with Anne Elliot, and how they are so different. We have Catherine as a sheltered character who isn't really aware of the society that she is in and the mold that she is being pressured almost to fit. And then we have Anne Elliot, who is the opposite, who's more outspoken, and we see Austen being able to flesh out two completely contrasting characters, but still have them develop character arcs within her novels. However, one thing that is very interesting throughout all of her work is the idea that each and every one of her strong or stronger, outspoken or stronger in their silence characters does end up following into a marriage plot. That is kind of the end, maybe not the end goal, but the result of each one of her novels, which makes these characters still available to the audience that they were being received into, that makes these characters somebody that matters, someone that somebody would want to read about, kind of countering the idea that you can't publish books about women because people won't relate to them or want to read them. Moving into Melody's point.
Hi, hello, my name is Melanie, and the title for my paper was Austen in Conservative Reform, the Presence of Agency in Austenian Fiction. And a lot of what I talk about is the fact that I believe the agency that's presented to female characters in Austen's novels is conservative in nature, because as Savannah discussed, she has each of the major female protagonists, all of the women in her novels, follow a marriage plot line. Because at this time in her society, marriage was an inevitability for women. It was a non-choice, something that they couldn't opt out of and still typically live a fulfilling life. But what we discussed in our panel is how women kind of get around that inevitability. And what I argue is that Austen lives up to this conservatism because her novels don't deconstruct it so much. She upholds the social order of English society while finding loopholes for her characters' happiness that allow it within this system. And I also look at conservatism in the idea of a critical essay written by Vivian Jones called Feminisms, which talks about something called the Conservative Reformation movement, which came about in the 19th century in Britain as a sort of response to the French Revolution. And it was an idea that when women followed typical gender expectations, such as getting married, they were committing a patriotic act, which kind of went with what was expected by them in this patriarchal society. So that's what she argues in her essay, and what I believe is that Austen did participate in this conservative reform, but in her own way, by allowing small amounts of choice for her protagonist, that every woman would walk down the but they would find their own ways to follow it. So Austenian scholars have noticed a pattern in her fiction that shows women making individual choices in a variety of ways, that they would choose to go about marriage in their own way by finding independence away from the families that they have grown up in to kind of make their own identity, or they would choose marriage, kind of speeding up the process to avoid spinsterhood, the idea that they would have limited rights as an unmarried older woman in their society, which is less desirable than getting married, even if they were not in love with the person they were with, because marriage would not be viewed as romantically as we would in our time. And so the idea of women trying to find new families through marriage is emphasized best through characters in Austen's novel Mansfield Park, in which the protagonist, called Fanny Price, she marries and achieves social mobility away from the family that she was born into, and a relation of hers, called Maria Bertram, chooses marriage as a form of independence, as once she is able to be away from her father's patriarchal type of control when he is on a temporary leave of absence from their estate, she gets a taste of the type of liberty that she feels she can experience through a marriage. So this is something that she would have gone through at some point anyway, because that was the path for women at this time, but she made it happen much faster. And it's something that, as a woman who was not particularly economically vulnerable, she wouldn't have to worry about as much as someone who had less money, but it would have still been her pathway. Similarly, there's this idea that the community can really hinder the agency of women, because a woman's family and the friends around her would heavily influence who she ended up marrying, kind of making the choice for her: this person is right for you, he has the most money, this is the right choice. Therefore, it would usually exist as a choice of the collective rather than the individual. And this is shown best in Austen's novel Sense and Sensibility through the characterization of the character Marianne Dashwood. In the beginning, she is very romantic, and she thinks that marriage should be kind of this romantic affair, but towards the end she views it more as a companionship, and she is stated as saying that she ended up in the marriage choice that she chose due to the confederacy around her, that was the community and her family, basically making that choice in her place, and that's how she reached the sort of decision that she got to. Related to that is the character of Elizabeth Bennet in Austen's very famous novel Pride and Prejudice, and conversely, she kind of went against the choice of her community, that she didn't succumb to that confederacy like the character Marianne did, because her mother and her father, everyone believed that she should go with the first choice she was given, because that's the smart thing, that's the practical thing. But Elizabeth was finding her own sense of agency by prolonging the inevitability of a marriage. She was stalling so that she wouldn't have to do it as soon, but she would have realized at the time that it was still something she would have to go through with as a woman of her position. But she kind of had this sense of an economic privilege, because she wasn't as bad off as another woman was, that she could make that choice to prolong it. But her best friend, Charlotte Lucas, was not within the same sort of economic situation. She was more economically vulnerable, therefore she didn't have the ability to prolong the choice. She wouldn't have thought about it in the same way that Elizabeth did, and they kind of had a conflict due to that. When she married, she was trying to avoid the spinsterhood that she could have faced, especially as a less economically advantaged unmarried woman. She would have had very limited rights in her society, and the smart decision was to marry for a sense of security and to find a sort of happiness in that choice, regardless of whether she was in love with the man that she was with. That was sort of besides the point for her, and that was something that, as we'll go on to discuss, Elizabeth didn't altogether agree with. And so I believe a lot of what Austen was doing is going along with the marriage plot for these women, because it was what was realistic for their time. She didn't give them liberties which would have been a fantasy for them, and so she placed them within a similar situation that she herself would have placed in the women that she herself knew. And I believe that adds to the realism of her work, and that we can still kind of find a sense of agency and feminism, even though I would still call the overall work that she does as conservative because it upholds the social order and kind of leads into the.
Hi everyone, I am Emily, and my paper is titled Individual Fulfillment Within or in Spite of Marriage. And so this is building off Melody's paper in which it's showing how Austen explores the non-choice of marriage as something that women must do, but also must somehow find individual fulfillment in some way. And I argue that she uses alternative narratives for this type of critique of marriage. And I think that this is most fully realized in her novel Pride and Prejudice, which is obviously a favorite. It's an iconic novel of hers. And so hopefully most of you guys know what I'm talking about for some of these things. So my main focus on my paper is with the characters Charlotte Lucas and Elizabeth Bennet. And they're two friends who represent this dichotomy between two opposing strains of the thoughts of marriage, with Charlotte being the very prudent, practical one, and Elizabeth having this romantic, idyllic view of marriage. And this dichotomy is distinctly established in Volume 1 of Pride and Prejudice, in which, when discussing the marriage or courting between Bingley and Jane, Charlotte describes that happiness in marriage is entirely a matter of chance. It is better to know as little as possible of the defects of the person with whom you are to pass your life. And that basically means that marriage does not necessarily mean happiness whatsoever, because happiness needs to be something found outside of marriage. And to kind of explain why this is so different from Elizabeth, who finds this statement shocking, I use the work of Melissa Moe, who wrote in her Multiple Modernities paper that Charlotte regards her internal narrative of growth and her social life as a single and then married woman as two separate strands. And so they are two different ideas of where individual fulfillment and marriage go within her life. And then Elizabeth is progressive, parallel to, and inextricable from internal growth of marriage. So she believes that marriage is this union between two people that elevates both parties and makes them better people and happier people. And though this is a dichotomy between two strands of viewing marriage, it is certainly not an equal dichotomy, in which Elizabeth, as a protagonist, as the likable character who is more fleshed out, she is obviously seen as the superior side of this viewing, which we definitely see in her rejection of Mr. Collins, who she tells him when he proposes that you cannot make me happy, and I am convinced that I am the last woman in the world who can make you so. And then Collins' absolute absurdity after her refusal and refusing to believe that she actually means this, it's like, oh, you're just being coy, is so annoying to read that automatically, it's annoying. Automatically the audience just adopts Elizabeth's, and pretty much Elizabeth's sense that this is the right choice, whereas Charlotte, when posed with the same exact proposal, automatically says yes for pure and disinterested desire of an establishment. And so for her, she uses a lot of clinical language describing what this transaction is for marriage, because for her it is a transaction. It is not something meant to be fulfilling and happy. It is meant to be something that gives you the stability that you can find some type of fulfillment outside of marriage rather than actually within it, because, as we'll kind of discuss, Charlotte's gay. It's just a thing, and so she's not going to find happiness within the marriage, so she needs to just get the stability of it because it's just a realistic thing, rather than actually eventually finding this happy union that Elizabeth speaks of. And in volume 2, this dichotomy between practical and romantic becomes a little bit muddled in which sides that we truly believe is correct. Because once we actually visit the happy or supposedly happy Charlotte, she seems like she's actually really enjoying marriage, and she's able to still somewhat talk to Elizabeth at this point, and she is exuding evident enjoyment with so cheerful an air that it gives some type of credibility. And even Elizabeth says that she didn't do that bad for herself, and having the protagonist who is so idealistic and romantic actually give respect to Charlotte's position gives it a little bit of credibility. And then, moreover, this dichotomy is further problematized by what in Jane Austen scholarship we call the moment of mortification, in which Elizabeth realizes that she is completely wrong about Darcy, but she rejects his proposal and realizes that she screwed up royally. And that makes it seem like her idea that, oh, you must love someone before you marry them and it's great, it just becomes so improbable because it gives credibility to Charlotte's idea that if she were married to him tomorrow, I should think she has a good chance of happiness as if she were to be studying his character for a 12th month. So that idea that you necessarily need to love your husband, or your, I guess, fiance at this point, doesn't necessarily entail individual fulfillment or happiness because you just don't know because of this misjudgment. And once you get to volume 3, it really does become unclear which side is actually the correct side. And here it is noted that Charlotte pretty much fades to the background of the novel, and she's just forgotten all of the drama. And some people might say that that means that she is unimportant. However, I think that that is specifically the reason her character is vital to Jane Austen's critique of marriage, because with Elizabeth we see all of this heartbreak and drama and her idea that, yes, though this ideal which would have been wonderful in which Darcy, who in disposition and talents would most suit her, his understanding and temper, though unlike her own, would have answered all our wishes, and for describing that their union would have been one that must have been an advantage to both by her ease and liveliness. His mind might have been softened, his manners improved, and from his judgment, information, and knowledge of the world, she must have received the benefit of greater importance. And so that idea sounds absolutely great, but it's also contrasted with the fact that she rejected him, and the probability that he would actually ask her to marry him again is just unrealistic whatsoever. And Elizabeth finally even says that if I have very good luck, I may meet another Mr. Collins in my time. And so in that moment, she actually approves of Charlotte's choice and makes it seem that even though it's Collins was absurd and couldn't offer her that marriage, marital happiness, it would nevertheless be something that would be good in the sense that it would give her that stability for individual or fulfillment otherwise. And so by kind of learning what is actually the proper path to idolize for marriage, Austen creates this complex interweaving of alternative narratives that suggest that there is a multiplicity and subjectivity to the relationship between marriage, individual fulfillment, and the limited agency of women, in which we can't even say that though Elizabeth's position seems romantic and ideal and she gets her fairy tale happy ending, we can't say that that's actually what all women should aspire to, because it's just, in the end, improbable, whereas Charlotte gives you that sense of doubt and shows you the realistic position that women during this time would have been in. And I think that this is my time to move it on to Victoria, because her paper is what I think all of you guys have been waiting for. It's a real game.
I only have a minute left, but
Victoria, we'll give you the rest
Oh,
so we'll
okay.
just take,
I
we'll
will-
have to
okay,
limit
I'm sorry.
very limited questions at the end. So
Okay.
take it away.
Y'all are gonna have so many questions. I'm so sorry. So I'm gonna use
Be around.
So Emily's jumping off point. I'm using as a jumping off point Emily's very excellent analysis of Charlotte, and just everyone else's points. To present my paper, Poor Old Maid: Class and the Lesbian Perspective in Pride and Prejudice and Emma. So I'm going to be using the theoretical framework of compulsory heterosexuality to look at Charlotte Lucas and then compare her to Emma Woodhouse, who's the protagonist of the later novel Emma. So according to the lesbian poet and theorist Adrienne Rich, women throughout history have been bound by what she calls compulsory heterosexuality. Basically, this is the patriarchal institution that inculcates in us this assumption that women are naturally heterosexual. It coerces women into performing heterosexuality, and ultimately it forces women to submit to patriarchal dominance. For example, to heterosexual marriage. Rich sees all forms of love between women as a deliberate way of resisting this male dominance. Basically, under compulsory heterosexuality, women deliberately focusing their energy on other women is an act of resistance, and choosing to live without men is radical. But this resistance is not limited to women who explicitly identify as lesbians. And to accommodate this, Rich suggests that we conceptualize all love between women and all women who focus their energies on other women as existing on a kind of lesbian continuum. So that's the language I'm going to be using for Charlotte and Emma, and that's why I'm going to be calling them lesbians, even though to a modern reader who doesn't know about Rich, this might seem anachronistic or ahistorical. This is the theoretical framework. So, as the others have shown, Charlotte Lucas is certainly bound by compulsory heterosexuality. She marries a guy she doesn't even like to satisfy social expectations. As Emily's shown, her view on marriage is not concerned with love or happiness. To her, it's simply the only honorable provision for well-educated young women of small fortune. Just this kind of necessity that she disinterestedly acquiesces to. In some ways, though, she does subtly challenge the doctrine of compulsory heterosexuality. Even if she sees heterosexual marriage as inevitable, she doesn't view heterosexual desire, as natural for women. As she tells Elizabeth, when it comes to falling in love with a man, a slight preference is natural enough, but there are very few of us who have heart enough to be really in love without encouragement. So not only are not all women heterosexual, but most women are not super heterosexual. But again, as Emily's shown, her perspective on this is kind of made marginal in the narrative. She kind of just drops out of the novel toward the end, but even before her disappearance, her perspective is marginalized by her lack of centrality in the novel and by the narrative style itself. So the free, indirect narrator that Austen is so famous for very rarely delves into Charlotte's perspective. We don't know what she's thinking. We don't have access to that, and as a result, the narrative doesn't facilitate sympathy with her view in the way that it does with a more central character like Elizabeth. As a result, she ends up seeming kind of inconsequential, at times ridiculous, in comparison to Elizabeth, whose perspective and attraction to men is centered in the novel. So in these ways, I argue that the lesbian narrative in Pride and Prejudice is stunted. Any critiques that Charlotte raises of compulsory heterosexuality are undercut by her absurdity, her delegitimacy, and her ultimate rejection by Elizabeth, the heterosexual who is central to the novel. However, Austen gives the lesbian perspective a new kind of centrality in her later novel, Emma. So Emma Woodhouse is immediately unique among Austen's heroines, who are generally, as others have shown, financially vulnerable women of the lower gentry who have to marry men. Emma is rich; she doesn't have to. As a result, she's free to choose whatever relationships are fulfilling to her. In this way, it could be said that Emma's the only Austen heroine with the privilege of having a sexual orientation.
very decidedly oriented toward her own sex. Not the first person to point out Emma's obvious lesbianism. You can Google it. But in summary, she's very obviously erotically attracted to women, and she has relationships with women that resemble lesbian marriages of the 19th century. So I want to ask, what is it that enables Emma to live her lesbian life more fully? And I argue that it is her wealth and class status. Emma freely admits to this. She says that as a rich woman, she has none of the usual inducements of women to marry, and thus she can dismiss heterosexual marriage completely. She continues, I shall not be a poor old maid, and it is not poverty which makes celibacy contemptible to a general public. A single woman with a very narrow income must be a ridiculous, disagreeable old maid, but a single woman of good fortune is always respectable, and may be as sensible and pleasant as anybody else. Essentially, Emma lays out for us the idea that lesbian possibility, lesbian existence, is classed. I think this class dichotomy perfectly illustrates the differences between Emma and Charlotte. Charlotte being the unrespectable, poor kind of lesbian, and Emma being the cool, rich, hot lesbian that everyone knows. So her opinion, while harsh, is just really the logical conclusion of Charlotte's assertion that the only honorable provision for a young woman of small fortune is to marry a man. By agreeing on this, and Austen by prison in this, they are all recognizing what Adrian Rich calls the great unacknowledged reality that is women's absence of choice. In the absence of choice, Rich says, women will have no collective power to determine the meaning and place of sexuality in their lives. In Austen's novels, essentially, ownership and direction of one's sexuality is a luxury that only a wealthy woman of the landed gentry could afford. Certainly not one that most of her protagonists, and certainly not one that Charlotte Lucas could afford. I am not going to attempt to make any conjectures about Austen's own personal life, but I do think it's striking that the only one of her protagonists with the power to chooses to love women. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we've gone over by a few minutes already, so we won't have time for